On the fourth day of their challenge, despite being hungry, Josh was still jovial, while Matt wore a worried look, unsure about the trap. However, this time it didn't disappoint. The trap caught many macrobrachium shrimp. Josh rekindled the fire, while Matt went searching for ingredients. He found some sorghum ginger, which was fruitier and spicier than wild ginger, a true Southeast Asian flavor. A few steps further, he discovered some breadfruit resembling green olives and tasting like tart apples, perfect as an ingredient. They had all the shrimp from the trap. Matt neatly cut off the shrimp tails and, given the survival situation, kept the heads. He stuffed them at the bottom of the bamboo, followed by a few slices of sorghum ginger and breadfruit, then some shrimp tail meat, repeating this layering process. They added water and cooked it next to the fire. As they opened the bamboo, a delicious aroma wafted out. The shrimp meat was temptingly pink and tender. Matt couldn't wait and divided the food into 2 portions. The shrimp's freshness, enhanced by the spicy sorghum ginger and the tartness of the breadfruit, created a burst of flavors that was simply irresistible, though the portion was a bit small. Josh, having caught a catfish from the fishing line, returned and declared he would cook this time. They were still hungry, and the catfish would help a little. However, Josh's cooking was rough. He just spit on and wiped the lid clean before throwing the fish on. As Matt waited for the meal, he realized a serious issue. Josh had forgotten to secure the boat with rope, and now it was drifting away. At that moment, Matt realized that the greatest danger wasn't the crocodiles in the river, but his partner. After eating a few bites of fish, Matt informed Josh about the lost boat. Josh chose to smile awkwardly to hide his embarrassment, and quickly suggested they could make a bamboo raft to leave. After several days, the trap for wild boar was still empty. They carried it back to camp, planning to dismantle it and use parts of it for the raft. But first, they needed another big meal to regain strength. Josh led Matt to a shallow part of the river, thinking they might find clams in the mud underfoot. The two began to dig, and surprisingly, Josh actually found some, which were quite large. After groping around for about 10 minutes, they dug up several dozen clams. They hadn't checked the shrimp trap yet today. When they did, they found it full again, this time also capturing a large blue crab. Now they had enough food for a grand meal. Matt's grill was put to use. They placed the shrimp on the lid to roast beside the fire. Using a wild knife, Matt split the clams open, scooped out the meat, and put it all into a split bamboo tube to cook. Afterward, they grilled it dry and dripped in some sour breadfruit juice. The blue crab was cleaned and then fried on an iron plate. Once everything was ready, they divided the meal into 2 portions. It was time for Josh and Matt to enjoy their delicious feast. The shrimp tails were full of flavor, and the shrimp roe in the heads was exceptionally tasty. Chewing the big chunks of clam meat was incredibly satisfying, and the energy kept flowing into their bodies, making them laugh uncontrollably. After finishing their last grand meal, the next day was time to leave. They packed up and boarded the bamboo raft. Its buoyancy was just right to support them, and the catamaran structure made it more stable. As the captain who was coming to pick them up appeared in the camera, this episode of their challenge came to an end. In the southern border areas of Mexico, there is one of the world's last remaining cloud forests. This lush and vibrant area is a dream location for many survival experts. This episode featured hunter Josh and chef Matt, who set out to survive there for 7 days with only a few basic tools. The production crew's vehicle dropped them off at the end of the road in the deep wilderness. Josh quickly got into the groove, planning to find a campsite near a water source where animals were plentiful. The humidity in the air reached 70%, making them sweat profusely after just a few steps. Although Josh soon saw wild boar tracks on the ground, he couldn't find a water source. After trekking for 3 hours, they were on the verge of dehydration. Matt accidentally tripped while walking, a far cry from the ideal start. It was a long time before they heard the sound of water from the mountain below. Overjoyed, they found a quiet stream lying in the jungle. While Matt was busy cooling his forehead, Josh caught a crab from the stream, hinting at good animal resources in the area. They returned to the mountain and chose a flat spot to set up camp, with plenty of easily cut bamboo nearby for building shelters, a task assigned to Josh. Meanwhile, Matt took a pot to the stream to look for dinner. Turning over the stones, he pulled out the crabs hiding underneath. They varied in size, some quite plump. Matt, the gatherer, began a crazy harvest. When he returned to camp with dozens of crabs, Josh had nearly finished building the shelter. Without further ado, they started a fire, as they were both hungry by then. Matt placed the crabs in his hat for Josh to watch while he went to prepare the fennel. Unfortunately, Josh, the clumsy one, knocked the hat over, and the crabs scattered everywhere. Both scrambled to catch them, but in the confusion, Matt accidentally cut Josh. The scene quickly turned chaotic. In the humid and steamy cloud forest, wounds can easily get infected. As Josh treated his wound, Matt decided to make a delicious meal to make amends. He dumped the crabs into a hot iron pot, crushed them with a stick to a fine mash, added water, and threw in peeled and sliced fennel. Once it boiled, they had a rich and flavorful soup, nutritionally balanced. The atmosphere lightened with the soup. The following morning, having metabolized through the night, they needed to find food again. Josh went hunting with a bow and arrow. He found an animal trail with signs of wild boars, but before finding any, he spotted some birds perched on a tree. They were big enough to fill their stomachs. He shot at them but missed, possibly due to his injured hand affecting his archery skills. Despite not hitting the birds, he found plenty of wild coffee beans that tasted somewhat like plums, good for snacks, but not filling. He returned to camp to change his hunting strategy, bringing a slingshot this time for Matt to use specifically for hunting birds. After a brief demonstration by Josh, Matt practiced with the slingshot by the river. Soon, he found a large bird in the bamboo forest and hit it with a stone from the slingshot. Although he searched desperately, the dense bamboo made it impossible to find the bird. Returning to the theme of gathering wild food, Josh noticed signs of a wild boar group and decided to set a trap. It was a typical noose trap, using a bent sapling for its elasticity and a knot on a hemp rope connected to a ground pressure plate, which would trap the animal by the ankle once triggered. Back to foraging, Matt found Central American palms, which are a type of wild corn rich in starch and carbohydrates. He then encountered a waterfall with several taro plants, locally called capote. Unaware that only the root of the taro was edible, he only cut off a few leaves. Nearby, he found some wild grapes, sweet and sour, rich in vitamin C. Josh remained as steady as ever in his performance, missing the large birds in the trees. Matt returned to camp, stripped the pure taro leaves from their stems, and cut the wild corn into segments to cook into a porridge. Unaware, the hunter scooped it up and ate, praising the taste until the chef felt a burning sensation in his mouth, realizing the taro leaves were toxic. On the third day, they woke up from hunger. They had not eaten solid food since the challenge began, and their energy levels were at an all-time low. Josh made a pot of tea with the grapes, which looked good and tasted refreshing. He was confident about the trap he set the day before, expecting to catch pork by evening. Full of hope, he went to check the trap, but the greater the expectations, the greater the disappointment. It had caught nothing. Fortunately, on his way back to camp, Josh stumbled upon an iguana lying motionless on a tree. He quickly stunned it with a stick and brought it back to camp, surprising Matt. Matt swiftly planned the meal. They still had some crabs left in a sock, which he used to make soup with fennel. He gutted the iguana, roasted it on a fire, and they had a meal of both meat and soup. That night, they finally sat down to enjoy their meal. The iguana meat was firm and slightly fatty, offering a delicate and aromatic taste. They did not spare even the bones, finishing the pot of crab and fennel stew, and only feeling half full. The next morning, Josh checked the trap again, guessing that the wild boars had not passed that way. He and Matt decided to relocate the trap, exploring a new area. There, Josh found fresh boar droppings and tracks not far away. They set a new trap using nearby bamboo as the structure and vines for binding, making a 2-meter-long rectangular cage. They mashed the remaining crabs and mixed them with grapes for bait. Once an animal entered and triggered the cage door, it would trap them inside. After setting the trap, they were nearly out of energy and faced another long wait. On the 6th day of the challenge, all their hopes were on the trap. This time, the jungle was generous, and a wild boar triggered the trap, getting caught inside. To humanely dispatch it, Matt cornered the boar with a stick while Josh stabbed it in the heart, ending its life instantly. It was not a large boar, but it was enough to sustain them until the end of the challenge. Before cooking, Matt looked for some seasoning. He found a few annatto trees, whose red seeds had a unique aroma suitable for marinating dishes. He placed the tougher shoulder meat in an iron pot, searing it until golden brown before simmering it in wild grape sauce. The tender loin and ribs were prepared differently. He ground the annatto seeds, coated the pork loin and ribs, and smoked the ribs in a tripod setup while roasting the loin over charcoal. The dripping juices made it look very appetizing. They hung the legs near the fire to cook thoroughly and placed some corn by the fire as a side dish. 9 hours after killing the boar, they were ready to enjoy their feast. The pork tenderloin was roasted to a crispy exterior and juicy, flavorful interior. Wild grape sauce was used to stew pork shoulder slices. A full plate of roasted tenderloin with corn was served. From a distance, the sight was mouth-watering. The dish could definitely be considered restaurant quality. Josh couldn't wait to take a bite. The pork shoulder was infused with the aroma of grape juice, not greasy at all. Instead, various flavors collided on the palate, making one reluctant to swallow without several chews. The roasted tenderloin was particularly excellent. When they awoke, it was the day to leave. They extinguished the fire and took the remaining 2 pork legs. This challenge ended successfully. This time, the 2 came to the cold polar regions of northern Finland. Here, temperatures were dozens of degrees below zero, presenting a new challenge for them. They still brought the usual survival tools and arrived at the starting point quickly by the show's snowmobile. Upon landing, they felt the extreme cold. Finding a suitable camping spot was imperative. However, the famously thick snow here made every step sink deeply, consuming their energy and slowing them down. They struggled forward only a few hundred meters in this manner. At this rate, it might take until next year to get out. Thus, the hunter decided to make snowshoes for both. He tied cut branches side by side to distribute their weight. Their walking speed improved significantly. According to the hunter's estimation, they only needed to find a frozen lake to survive. Soon, an open area appeared ahead. The hunter immediately instructed the cook to dig down, but after digging a few times, mud and water gushed out, emitting a foul smell. It turned out to be just a cold swamp. To find their target, they had to keep moving. They continued along the forest for another 2 kilometers. Finally, a frozen lake appeared ahead. After a quick survey of the surroundings, they decided to build a shelter under a pine tree. The hunter collected soft branches for a mattress, while the cook dug a pit in the ground and evenly spread the branches inside. Making a good insulation was crucial to avoid the cold. However, the most important thing was to start a big fire, ensuring they wouldn't worry about tinder for the next few days. He then took out a flint from his bag and also brought some tinder cloth. Just a small spark was enough to start a fire. With the fire going, both felt an unprecedented warmth. The cook immediately used the pot to melt snow for drinking water. After resting by the fire for a bit, the 2 began planning for the next day, aiming to start searching for protein. Upon reaching the next day, the hunter suggested they could fish in the center of the lake as long as they could break through the ice. He then started looking for bait around the area. The fresh sawdust on the trees indicated there were juicy caterpillars inside. The first one he found was a reward for himself. The rest would later be used for fishing. He chopped a stick and sharpened its tip to use as an ice-breaking spear. With their equipment, they cautiously headed to the center of the lake. Fortunately, the ice wasn't very thick, and they quickly managed to make a large hole. The rest of the time was spent sitting by the shore, fishing at length. Meanwhile, the cook planned to search the opposite shore of the lake for food ingredients. He quickly found wild juniper berries under a tree, whose aroma could be used for grilling fish. He had hoped to find some edible blueberries on the ground, but after digging around, he found nothing. Worried that his teammate might not bring back any food, he turned his attention to pine bark, which was said to have been used as food by Finns hundreds of years ago. After peeling off the hard outer shell of the pine, the soft inner part was safe to eat. He collected a full shovel of it, and couldn't wait to get back to the camp to cook. By that time, the hunter had been guarding the lake surface for over 3 hours. Cold and shivering, he hadn't seen a single fish. Seeing that continuing like this was futile, he used branches to cover the hole and returned to the camp empty-handed. To fill their stomachs, they had to try to satisfy their hunger with tree bark, which was said to contain 6 or 7 nutrients and could supplement the trace elements needed by the human body. The cook then boiled the bark in water until soft. When he opened the lid to check, the hunter exclaimed that with such cooking skills, he should never open a restaurant. Unexpectedly, the bark was extremely unpalatable. As night fell, they stuck to the old rule of going hungry for the night. The next morning, the hunter checked the fish hooks on the lake surface, but unfortunately, they were as clean as his own face. Not finding any food made him feel very dejected. Likewise, the cook, who had hoped to find blueberries, came back empty-handed. With half a week already gone, both had persisted by just enduring hunger. It seemed the icy, snowy conditions were a significant challenge for them. On the fourth morning after getting up, they brewed pine needle tea to warm up a bit. The hunter returned to the lake to check the traps, but unfortunately, no big fish had taken the bait. Not wanting to give up, he sat at the hole and tried again. Soon there was a movement on the fish hook. Pulling it up, though the fish was not very big, a mosquito is still meat no matter how small. He continued fishing and quickly caught a second one, followed by a third. It seemed they had finally found the right spot, eventually catching 7 small bass in total. Bringing back the hard-earned catch to the camp, the cook was astonished at the size of the fish. But as both needed protein at that moment, he used an iron shovel and the collected juniper berries to pan-fry the fish. In just 2.5 minutes, a delicious meal was ready. For the first time in 5 days, they had meat, briefly boosting their energy. They ate quickly, leaving no bones behind. With renewed energy, the hunter planned to search farther for beavers, known for their meat but hard to find, typically living around river valleys. After trekking 2 kilometers, a large pile of grass appeared, clearly a beaver lodge. The hunter devised a plan to break their dam, lowering the water level to force the beavers out for repairs, giving him a hunting opportunity. He carefully approached the dam, cleared it with a stick, and waited as the water flowed out. Meanwhile, the cook ventured out to gather supplies and soon found valuable berries on a rock face, quickly gathering a large handful, along with wild lingonberries and deer grass, all safe to eat. He packaged some to take back to camp, and on the way back discovered an anthill. Normally ignored, he tried some ants, finding them sour and sweet, like lemons. The hunter had been watching the river for over 4 hours without spotting any beavers. If none appeared by nightfall, they would have to build a shelter to stay overnight. With the hunter away, the cook successfully made a fire on his first try. Feeling capable again, he stir-fried the gathered deer grass, adding some sour ants, and found the taste surprisingly perfect, rich in protein and fiber, though the distant hunter couldn't taste it. As the hunter kept watch, the day turned to evening, and he had no choice but to dig a snow pit to survive the night. On the 5th day, the hunter returned empty-handed to camp, and was thrilled to see the cook had prepared a meal. After eating, they discussed their plan. Catching a beaver alone was difficult. They decided to take a shortcut to the beaver dam together, but had to cross a river, planning to fell a tree to use as a bridge. Just then, the cook slipped and fell into the icy river. With the hunter's help, he barely managed to climb out, feeling an intense chill. The hunter advised him to keep moving and use snow to dry off, but the cook was too frozen to move his limbs. Seeing the danger, they quickly returned to camp. Quickly strip and get into the sleeping bag. The hunter takes charge of building the campfire to boil water. A gulp of the piping hot water slightly soothes the cook. The remaining time is used to dry clothes. By the 6th day, the cook's wet clothes are finally dry. They check the fish hooks on the lake surface. Perhaps pity from the heavens, they finally catch a 4 to 5 pound shuttlefish. Returning to camp, the cook hurries to prepare it using local cooking methods. Meanwhile, the hunter chops wood for a chopping board and simmers wild berries in a pot until thick. He evenly spreads the mixture on the fish and sprinkles some salt on top before roasting it by the fire for half an hour. Once done, he pours the delicious jam over the fish, enhancing its flavor with the sweet and sour jam, 10 times tastier than any paper-wrapped fish sold outside. Although they didn't feast like royalty, they weren't starving throughout the challenge. Soon, it's time to go home. They quickly pack up and meet with the crew at the designated spot, ending their wilderness adventure successfully. Located in Pulau Tiga, off the coast of Malaysia, this uninhabited island is hot and humid year-round. For this episode, the cook and hunter must survive for 7 days on the island, managing to eat and attempt to make royal cuisine using only a few pieces of equipment and the hunter's diving gear. Known first in wilderness survival is finding a drinkable water source. However, the dense vegetation makes even walking difficult. Soon they encounter a large puddle and spot a crocodile underwater, startling them. To check if the water is drinkable, the hunter risks tasting it. only to confirm it's a salty waterhole, likely filled by the tidal surge. Without food, one can last 3 days, but without water, it's risky even for a day. Continuing inland, they find a dried riverbed. If they follow the valley, they might find a pond. However, with the midday temperature rising, the cook shows signs of heat stroke, feeling dehydrated and headachy. Knowing the urgency, the hunter accelerates their pace and finds some thick vines. From over a decade of wilderness experience, he's sure they contain some fresh water. As expected, when cut, the liquid drips out, and the parched cook drinks eagerly. After a slight rehydration, they press on and soon find a small puddle of fresh water. Fearing diarrhea from drinking untreated water, they start a small fire to boil the water before satisfyingly drinking it. As the sun sets, the hunter tries to catch fish by the sea using hermit crab meat as bait, expecting rich marine resources. However, after a long attempt, not a single fish is caught. With no choice, they face hunger honestly on their first night. The next morning after waking up, the two planned to go out in search of protein. The hunter took her diving gear to fish in the sea, while the cook went around gathering usable materials. The beach was littered with human trash washed ashore, likely containing many useful items. The cook then plunged into the jungle, hoping to find some edible food. However, the island's environment was not as rich as a forest's. He found nothing edible after a long search. Meanwhile, the diver didn't fare any better. The visibility underwater was less than half a meter, making it hard to spot any fish or shrimp. Back at the camp, the cook made a good find, a tender green coconut on the beach, oddly without a coconut tree in sight. He concluded it must have washed ashore. Sure enough, upon checking the beach, he found another coconut. Shaking them, he found they still contained plenty of juice. When he returned to the camp and learned the hunter had caught nothing, the cook realized the situation was far different from what he had imagined. Not wanting to starve, the hunter collected hermit crabs from the beach, a relatively simple task. They then cracked open the coconuts to collect the water, not wasting the coconut meat either. It was time for the Michelin-starred chef to perform. He started by boiling the coconut water and meat, then added the hermit crabs. A few minutes later, the meal was ready. The hunter tasted it first, but immediately spit it out. The cook thought there was a problem with his cooking, but after tasting it himself, he grimaced in pain. The flavor was unexpectedly strong. To avoid diarrhea, they decided to continue starving. By the third day, seeing almost no resources on the island, the hunter had a bold idea: to try their luck on a small island across the water, known to be surrounded by coral reefs, which naturally attract fish. However, the two needed to build a raft, a risky endeavor. The cook felt it was too adventurous. The consequences of sinking midway were unimaginable. But seeing the hunter's serious demeanor and lacking any better ideas, he agreed to go along with it. Next, they gathered materials for the raft. Fortunately, the beach was strewn with dry bamboo and other trash like plastic bottles and fishing line, which could be useful. They used the rope they found to securely tie the bamboo poles together. After 3 to 4 hours of hard work under the sun, they finally constructed the raft's frame. By evening, they made do with some coconut meat to get by. By the 4th day, they had packed their luggage, taking the little fresh water and equipment they had left, and set off towards the small island. Surprisingly, the raft was very buoyant and moved smoothly. The two sat on the raft, chatting and laughing, and quickly covered a good distance. By noon, the temperature on the sea surface began to spike, but they had no intention of stopping. After all, there was no shade on the raft, and they were determined not to rest and expose themselves to the sun any longer than necessary. After rowing for 2.5 hours, they finally reached the shore by noon. Unfortunately, this island was even more desolate than the original, with not a single sign of life. However, their goal was not to explore the island, but to hunt the fish around the coral reefs. The hunter prepared a straight stick, tied the rubber bands from a slingshot to it, and fixed an arrowhead to create a powerful spear. With this weapon in hand, the hunter eagerly dived into the sea and began hunting the fish by aiming at them from above. After several powerful strikes, a foolish grouper was hit. Before the hunter could celebrate, he spotted a lobster under the rocks, a luxurious delicacy in the wild. He surfaced to prepare adequately, then dove back to its lair, severely wounded it with the stick, and pulled it out mercilessly with his bare hands. Finally, they could enjoy a feast. Meanwhile, the chef on the shore had found plenty of wild sea grapes, a pricey garnish in restaurants, but here, abundant and free. When the hunter returned to shore loaded with catches, the chef couldn't help but laugh, surprised at the luxurious bounty. After a simple preparation of the grouper and lobster, which also yielded numerous baby lobsters, they threw everything into a pot for a hearty stew. 30 minutes later, a delicious seafood stew was ready. The sight and smell were enticing, and the taste was incredible. Soft, sweet, and rich. The hunter licked his fingers clean, not wanting to waste a drop of the flavorful juices. By the 5th day, they needed to think about returning. However, the hunter wanted to catch some fish underwater, while the chef fished from the raft. Time quickly passed, and half an hour later, the hunter had not surfaced. Even the ropes securing the raft had loosened, which greatly worried the chef. Fearing his partner might not surface, he began to loudly call the hunter's name. If something went wrong, he feared he couldn't reach the shore alone. After shouting for half an hour with no response from the hunter, the chef feared the worst. Eventually, the hunter surfaced in the distance. Learning of the chef's concern for his safety, he was touched. Although no fish were caught, both safely returned to camp and rested by the shore. The chef then went to the usual spot to collect fresh water, but discovered something valuable on the way. He found that the tops of tall palm trees were edible. Excited, the chef immediately chopped down the trunk and tasted the stem, which was incredibly crunchy and subtly sweet. However, this was not enough to satisfy their hunger. As night fell, they planned to catch some fish under the cover of darkness and went to the shore with their equipment. While searching in the water, the hunter quickly spotted a red rainbow fish and immobilized it with a stone. Together, they successfully caught it. By the 7th day, to cook their hard-earned meal, the chef searched the surroundings for side dishes. He quickly found many curry leaves on the ground, which smelled uniquely perfect for stewing. Back at camp, the chef began to show his skills by cooking the collected coconut milk until thick, then added the chopped red meat and some palm stems he had gathered. He tasted it and found the flavor impeccable. As the meal was ready, they finally sat by the shore to enjoy their food. With the slow arrival of a yacht, their survival adventure on the island came to a successful conclusion.